I believe that there is that people looking at sort of the cliff that we're, that America's just hurtling towards this cliff and about to go over. I think an awful lot of people, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews and others, would be willing to negotiate some kind of a return of, let's say, the basic Christian moral vision to be like the public background against which things are operate in some places. I mean, in some states in the U.S. And I think the conservative way to do this is, not to have the Supreme Court, dictate this to people who don't want it. The conservative way to do it is to experiment with it in those places that want it, so that we can see what does this add up to.
So do you think secular institutions simply cannot work at all? I mean, basically what you're saying is I guess everything is going to degrade over time, right?
Everything degrades over time. The question is, are you helping it degrade, or are you working for a restoration where you can see that a mistake has been made, so you can act to try to stop it? Look, Dave, I'm a religious person. In the end, I think we have to do what looks right to us the best we can. In the end, we're really bad at seeing the future, and what's going to happen is God decides in the end what's going to come of all of our efforts. But we have an obligation to try to restore things, to try to restore respect for the American Constitution and the Anglo-American legal tradition. We have to try to restore respect for the traditional family and for the Bible and for God. That's up to us to try to do, and maybe it'll work.
So I think a certain amount of people are watching this, and what they may not know is on the other side of that very fine head of hair, my friend, is a yarmulke back there. You are an Orthodox Jew. You live in Jerusalem, and yet here you are talking about Anglo beliefs, Christian America, things like that. I was on a panel with you at NatCon where we were trying to sort of work out. It was the two of us and Sohrab Ahmari, who I've had on the show, and Douglas Murray, who I've had on many times, trying to sort of whittle out where, if you were to go back to some of what you're calling for in a national conservative country, what happens to the minorities? What happens to the religious minorities? What happens to people that don't necessarily prescribe to all of the sort of religious set of views that you're including here? So what do we do with that?
Okay, well, the book deals with two different fronts. Okay, one is the question you're asking me now, which is about the public life of the country, and the other part of the book deals with with our private lives, and because people tend to think these things are unrelated, I think they're deeply connected. And so the book is really an argument for people to drop the idea that you can just argue for conservative policy. I think that you have to also lead a conservative life. You have to come back to a conservative life and be a conservative person. So there are those two things. Now, when I talk about conservative democracy, I'm talking about a democracy. Right, I'm talking about the kind of democracy that America was. Sure, there's some things from the past that we should never go back to. I mean, slavery and persecution of blacks in America, just as like the most obvious example. I don't know any conservative that wants to go back to that. In fact, in my book, I make the argument that was a deviation from the Anglo-American tradition, which is, for a very long time was anti-slavery before there were slaves in America. But since I'm arguing for democracy, I'm still talking about the political framework where this should not be imposed on anybody. We're talking about those states that still have a Christian majority, or let's say, maybe there's Orthodox Jews who would support this kind of thing, or others. So those states, those regions, those places where there's still a desire to lead a democratic life, but where the public the public philosophy, let's say, is not neo-Marxism. The public philosophy is going to be based on a biblical vision, on a Christian and Jewish vision. And my assumption is that that anybody who actually wants to do this, I'm not just assuming it. I mean, this is what I talk to Catholics and Protestants and Jews. I talk to them and try to understand people from all over the country, like what's possible. And I believe that there is that people looking at sort of the cliff that America's just hurtling towards this cliff and about to go over. I think an awful lot of people, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews and others, would be willing to negotiate some kind of a return of, let's say, the basic Christian moral vision to be like the public background against which things are operate in some places. I mean, in some states in the U.S. And I think the conservative way to do this is, not to have the Supreme Court, dictate this to people who don't want it. The conservative way to do it is to experiment with it in those places that want it, so that we can see what does this add up to, instead of saying, well, Christians were always terrible throughout their history. Let's see what the Christian, which I don't believe, by the way, but instead of that kind of argument in the air, we should do an experiment. Let's see. Let's see what what are the Christians in America when they get to be like the public culture in a few states? What do? If it's better, and I'm guessing it's going to be better. If it's better, so people want to move there, and other states will adopt it. And if it's as terrible as everybody's always saying, to let the to let the Christians, where they're a majority, let them have the public. If it's so awful, so we'll see that it's awful, and we'll say, okay, we tried that didn't work. Let's do something else.
So do you see something like what's going on here in Florida, where I think we're defending almost everything you're talking about, but not from the religious perspective, in that the governor is not up there talking about this stuff from a religious perspective. However, he's doing a lot of the work that I think you're calling for.
Yep.
He is acknowledging differences biologically between boys and girls and getting rid of critical race theory out of the schools. And he's fighting against a constantly overreaching federal government, all those things. I sense that you still think that may not be enough for the experiment as you want it. Is that right?
No, I don't think it's enough, because I mean the basic problem is that for many years most liberal scholars and professors who talked about this kind of thing, theorists, they talked about liberalism as a neutral state, like a state that wouldn't actually have any kind of moral vision. It would just be neutral and let everybody do what they want. And this book argues, and I mean, I'm certainly not the only one, but I'm arguing there is no such thing as a neutral state. Like you can try it, but it continues to be mostly Christian values up until the moment that it just falls apart, and you suddenly realize that it's anti-Christian. And I think that's what's happening that's what's happening in America and in Britain and other places too, is that there is a public philosophy, but that public philosophy is progressive, woke, neo-Marxism. And I know that there are a lot of good liberals who they want to hold on to the idea of, well, let's just go back to a neutral state. And I think they just don't understand that's collapsed, and it hasn't collapsed by accident. It's collapsed because of the fact that when you're saying, no, the state is neutral, we don't have to defend any particular set of values, when you say that, then you just open the door for the Marxists to take over. The only way you can fight like a serious public religion or public philosophy is with another public philosophy.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.